thank you everybody. This is the Halloween Rust Team Special edition. We're talking about Diaschesis and Gain today. Everybody here is somewhat familiar, got some background. Tim, you guys do a little bit? Okay. So this is a pretty critical thing for us, and it really opens up my understanding of all of functional neurology. The definition of diaschesis is depression of brain function in an anatomically intact portion of the brain that results from dysfunction in a remote but functionally related neuronal group. I have a better definition in here. Basically what it is that you're going to have breakdown in one area of the nervous system that is functionally connected but not anatomically connected. And that breakdown will cause breakdown in that later part. So it's called diaschesis. So what it means, and this is really where chiropractic starts to bloom, is your spine generates input. And the input from your spine is the major passive tonic driving input to the central nervous system. So your brain can compare what is reality, what is new, what is different, when things start, when things end, from input from the spine. It's its baseline for everything in comparison. But when you have a breakdown in the spine, you have a subluxation, what happens is, alright, so anyway, wherever we were. Breakdown in the spine, right? It's not going to lead, you have subluxations, it leads to a disafferentation to the central nervous system. I can do English today. Central nervous system. So this is called diaschesis because now since your brain is reliant on that input from your spine, it's not getting anymore, it starts to go downhill. And we get transneural degeneration. So diaschesis is going to cause TND in different parts of the nervous system that are connected. So I could have a bad shoulder, right? That's in a cast for like, I'll edit, for a couple weeks, right? And because I don't have input from the shoulder, I'm not inputting my cerebellum that is related to the shoulder. And now we can see on scans changes in that cerebellum because of the bad shoulder. We're going to see decreased blood flow, we'll see decreased oxygen consumption, right? And that is going to be our measures for neurons going downhill. It means that the neurons, their metabolism isn't working as well because they're not being fed. And what happens is then we come along chiropractic, we blow their shoulder up, we cause this major input to it, but then all day long now they're moving the good shoulder, they're reafferenting the system, the cerebellum, and it starts to get healthier again. So that's diaschesis. Now a really cool thing about diaschesis is they found the best diaschesis lesion is in 50% of people with well-defined cortex lesions. They're going to have diaschesis in the contralateral cerebellum. 50% of these people. So you'll see a strong hemisphericity in this person. You can't assume they got a cerebellar lesion, but there's a good chance they do because this cortex is firing into this cerebellum. And when this cortex goes downhill and doesn't fire in, because it has a decreased frequency of firing like we talked about last week, now this cortex starts to get diaschesis, starts to show transneural degenerative changes, and starts to go downhill. So that's the most common type of diaschesis. Now there's other types of diaschesis. There's a whole list of them. You can have the cortex isn't firing, so yeah, messes up the contralateral cerebellum. Contralateral pons is a big one. Contralateral cortex, firing through the corpus callosum. Other ones are going to be the ipsilateral thalamus that's connected to the ipsilateral cortex, so a problem in the parietal lobe, cause a problem in the frontal lobe, diaschesis. Ipsilateral basal ganglia or ipsilateral visual cortex. Now, does that make sense? And this is what happened to Harvey Lillard, right? He had, I'm guessing C2. I've heard a whole bunch of stories, but it was up there, right? And it wasn't moving, and it wasn't generating input to drive his cortex, and so his cortex started to go through diaschesis and have transneural degenerative changes, and then he wasn't able to process sensory information because I said the spine is the baseline, it fires up to the brain and spreads everywhere in its input. And so now that he had a decrease in frequency of firing because of this diaschesis, he wasn't able to perceive sound. His ears still worked, the nerves still worked, sound still came in, it just wasn't his cortex wasn't at a threshold high enough to bring it to consciousness. We adjust him, he goes home, he sleeps on it, it's moving, we do that for about a week, and we rehab the brain, and now he can hear sound. Not because, and that's a diaschesis event right there. That's where I really like this stuff. So what's important about diaschesis is you have to start tracing back to the origin of the lesion. because one lesion up here will feed forward into all these other areas and start causing lesions in those areas. And then you see these people go downhill, and a little bit of input right there in their cortex is going to start getting their mesencephalon higher up again, start getting the cerebellum up again, and then, yeah, this DDK is going to improve by improving this cortex, and that could be through eye exercises. So we could see us giving them never touching them, doing eye exercises or no PK, and their cortex gets stronger, and since that fires into these other areas, they start to get stronger and work better. Cool. Diaschesis. Commit to memory. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in here on negative effects of altered proprioception. I just want to read a couple of them. Joint capsular proprioceptors connect with gamma motor neurons and can alter sensitivity of muscle spindles, causing disturbances in muscle tone and restrict motion. Subluxations, that's what we deal with all the time. Gapping of the joint by spinal manipulation induces a sudden burst of capsular afferent activity, which can cause reflex decreases in muscle tone, allowing for an increase in joint movement. All these are talking about altered effects of proprioception. Your spine isn't working, and you're getting diaschet changes in other areas. That's why the tone starts to go downhill. An injured joint is likely to cause persistently disturbed sensory feedback to the central nervous system, and therefore existing motor programs have to be modified. Just another example. So there's a whole bunch of good stuff like that in Modulate 01 that you guys should look at. The other thing that we want to talk about today is gain. You guys hear gain before? And I really like how Shag Rose broke it down. Can we all see this? Is it showing up on video? Okay. So we see these muscles like this. This is subluxation, right? Joint position error. It's okay, I'll explain it. So what we're seeing right here is we're just seeing an open wedge on this side, an open wedge, and this is straight and it's open here, right? So all of these paraspinal muscles are going to be stretched, they're higher, and these ones are shorter, right? Well, the thing is, what is setting the tone for these muscles? These are non-volitional. We can't control these muscles. They're all reflexogenic in action, right? And so our brain is coordinating how long or how short these muscles have to be through gain. So do we have a clear definition on gain, Adam? I couldn't find one in the notes.
No, I think it was.
Okay, I just think of gain as a distortion or the stretch of the muscle spindles. So what you think of is, here's your spinal cord right here in the middle, and it's setting gamma motor neuron tone to the muscle spindles. So it fires out through the ventral horn, it's the motor neuron, comes out, hits the muscle spindle. But it hits the polar ends of the muscle spindle, and that's these ends, right? So when you have an increased frequency of firing of gamma motor neuron tone, increased frequency of firing, what happens is these polar ends shorten. And what happens is when they shorten, it starts to stretch this inside part a little bit. And this inside part is covered in annulospiral endings and flower spray endings, which fire 1A afferents and 1B afferents. So when you have an increased frequency of firing of your gamma motor neuron tone, what you get is a decrease in gain and an increase in sensitivity. So always think of those. Low gain, high sensitivity. High gain, low sensitivity. They're opposite. And what it means is a little bit of stretch is going to fire these way fast because these polar ends are short, putting preload on this inside the intrafusal fibers. Now you have an increase in sensitivity, and every time you move, you have an increase in 1A afferents and type 2 afferents, right? And so now, this guy fires back on here to the spinal cord. And when he gets to the spinal cord, he does a couple different things. He's going to synapse, again, with these gamma motor neurons, and thus modify the length of the polar ends. but then he's going to fire over to the other side and inhibit these. We had talked about cross cords the other day. You're going to want to have a shortening of this muscle. So it's actually an ipsilateral firing pattern. You want to have a shortening of the biceps with a relative lengthening of the triceps. So these are always in communication in the spinal cord through this mechanism of gain. And as the sensitivity changes, the gamma motor neuron tone coming out changes, and you have an increased sensitivity to stretch. Now, gamma motor neuron tone is set by the ipsilateral cortex through the pontomedullary reticular formation. So when I have a decrease in right brain, I have a decrease in my PMRF on the right, thus I have a decrease in gamma motor neuron tone. And what happens is we have an overall decreased tone in that same side of the body. So how does that manifest when we have a decreased global tone because we can't set these gamma motor neurons? This is what you see. You see that these are getting a bit bigger because they're less sensitive to stretch, and these get shorter because they're more sensitive to stretch. And thus we can actually build a mechanism now how a cortical problem can cause subluxations. Joint position errors, subluxations can cause problems to the nervous system through diaschesis like we just talked about, or problems in the nervous system can cause subluxations like these, and it's going to be a bad feedback loop at that point. So it's up to you as a practitioner to start to say what's causing which. And one way to do that is challenge the system. Give them a little bit of brain activity without touching the subluxation, and then reevaluate the subluxation. If it goes away, then it's brain-based. If you can't change it by changing the brain, then maybe it's a real joint position error, and then maybe you do need to go in and do the adjustment. But you want to be careful with the adjustments, and I really want to get a clear formula on when it is or is not okay to adjust somebody. I'd say anybody in this room, we're pretty much clear to adjust. We're young, we're healthy, we eat right, we exercise. You can start to assume these people can do it. But when you have an 80-year-old woman limping into your office who's been a smoker for 20 years, don't adjust her. Make sure her brain's pretty healthy. See if you can clear these up without the adjustments. Because in over-adjustment, you start to stretch the ligaments, you can get ligament laxity. When you have ligament laxity, now they are not going to be at threshold as easily, and these things won't fire because the ligaments are all loose because we stretch them out from too much. Does that make sense? Yeah. And another thing about diaschesis that I want to go back to for a second is the upper cervical spine has more mechanoreceptors than the rest of the spine put together, 240 muscle spindles per gram in the suboccipitals. So an upper cervical subluxation is going to cause a massive diaschesis to the system. That's why it's so effective. But again, you want to watch out before delivering a large, high-velocity, low-amplitude thrust to the upper cervical spine and causing a massive wave of input. Is there anything else to add to gain in this?
That's pretty thorough.
Okay.
We could put down 4 presynaptics to the gamma motor neurons, so everybody has them.
One thing about gain that I want to mention real fast is that when you start thinking about the innervation, it's not one gamma motor neuron to one muscle spindle. It's going to be one gamma motor neuron to a chunk of muscle spindles. But in the eyeballs, where you don't have very big muscles, you're going to have like 1 gamma per muscle spindle. So it's going to be a whole lot more sensitive to gain in the eyes. And so when you do a VOR and you fire these canals, the eyes should go this way, right? But if they go too far because you have a problem in gain, it's easier to see in the eyes than it is in huge muscles like the latissimus dorsi or whatever. So that's why we use eyes a lot, is because they're going to be a really clear indicator. And if they went too far, we'd say they have a 2-to-1 gain. Their gain is twice as much as it should be, or it's too high.